A crown is supposed to mean power, privilege, legacy. But for some royals, it meant betrayal, madness, explosions, and very suspicious staircases. These aren't fairy tales. They're royal exit strategies, written in whispers and sealed with silence. From beheadings that went wrong to plane crashes no one talks about, history's most privileged heirs often met endings fit for their worst enemies. Because if you think dying rich and royal means dying well, you're about to meet 20 reasons why that's never guaranteed. This is 20 worst ways British royals have died. Before we descend any deeper into royal doom and mystery, make sure you're subscribed. We drop stories like this all the time, and trust me, they only get weirder. Also, quick roll call. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you're listening to royal history go completely off the rails? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who else is wandering the timeline with us. 1. Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born in a storm and buried in a whisper, which is saying something, given the whole head chopped off in public part. Mary, Queen of Scots, had one of those lives that feels suspiciously like a Gothic novel written by someone with a grudge against monarchies. A queen by 6 days old, a widow by 18, and a prisoner for nearly 2 decades, she became the ultimate political pawn in a game that had no rules, only axes. Mary was executed in 1587 after 19 years of being politely imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I. The official reason? Treason. The unofficial one? Mary existed. She had the bloodline, the charm, and the Catholic backing to make Protestant England very nervous. Her death was a stage play gone wrong. The executioner needed multiple swings to finish the job. One version says he held up her severed head, only for it to drop, wig and all, revealing her gray hair underneath. Her little dog was later found hiding under her petticoats, soaked in her blood. England tried to make it look like justice. History turned it into theater. But Mary's death was never just an execution. It was a warning, muffled under velvet. A queen gone and yet not quite gone enough. Which brings us to another royal whose death was just as public, but not nearly as poetic. 2. Charles I. You can almost picture the cold morning of January 30th, 1649. The fog clinging to Whitehall, the crowd holding its breath, and the King of England in 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver and look afraid. Charles I, divine right incarnate, was about to be introduced to a very secular axe. The English Civil War had unraveled everything. Parliament had revolted. Cromwell had risen. Charles had lost. But he still believed he was God's chosen. So naturally, he refused to plead. Not guilty, not anything. Silence was his defense, and defiance his last word. They built the scaffold outside the banqueting house. Ironic, considering the last time he stood there, it was to commission ceiling paintings glorifying monarchy. As he laid his head on the block, he reportedly whispered, "I am the King of England. I am the martyr of the people." The axe came down. One clean cut. No second chance. Europe was horrified. Regicide? That was a French thing. And yet, here lay a beheaded king whose blood stained not just the scaffold but the soul of a nation. Even those who wanted him gone didn't quite know what to do afterward. Because once you kill a king, what do you do with the silence that follows? Unless, of course, you replace that silence with screams. Which brings us to Edward II. 2 royals down, 18 to go. And if you think the worst is behind us, oh no, we're just setting the table. While the monarchy crumbles softly in the background, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories don't tell themselves, and they definitely don't end with a clean curtain call. Also, let's check in. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your corner of history? Morning? Midnight? Somewhere in between? Drop it in the comments. We're building a very strange royal court down there. 3. Edward II. If Charles I died with dignity, Edward II died with something closer to medieval improv horror. Officially, he died mysteriously in Berkeley Castle after being deposed by his wife and her suspiciously powerful advisor. Unofficially, his death was so brutal that even chroniclers started writing in vague Latin. You know it's bad when 14th century monks are like, let's just not say. Edward II was never meant to be a hero, or a king, or alive really. At least not after 1327. His reign was chaos on a horse, military failures, disastrous favoritism, and an open relationship with power that made nobles boil with rage. His wife Isabella, daughter of the King of France, eventually joined the rebellion to remove him. Her lover, Roger Mortimer, helped make sure Edward's retirement package included 0 sunlight and a lot of chainmail. Imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, Edward's condition mysteriously deteriorated. Some accounts claim illness. Others suggest he was helped along. The most infamous version, not quoted here for reasons, became so infamous it's still debated. But whatever the truth, his screams were said to echo through the stone walls that night. It was meant to be a cover-up. Instead, it became a ghost story. And ghosts, as we'll soon see, don't fade easily, especially when they wear crowns like Richard II. 4. Richard II. Richard II was born under a banner of poetry and ceremony, and died in silence behind castle walls, forgotten by most and mourned by no one. He was a child king with a crown too heavy for his head and a temperament better suited for salons than for battlefields. Art, pageantry, divine right. These were the tools he believed would hold a kingdom together. Unfortunately, England was more interested in swords, taxes, and weather that didn't come with flowery metaphors. By the time he was deposed in 1399, Richard had alienated just about everyone who once cheered for him. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, gathered a few angry lords, and took the throne with astonishing ease. Richard, betrayed and abandoned, was quietly tucked away in Pontefract Castle, a name that would become synonymous with the slow erasure of a monarch. What happened next was suspiciously vague. Officially, he died by starvation. Some say he was forced to fast. Others say he refused to eat out of protest. Either way, by February 1400, the former king was dead. His body displayed briefly to prove he was gone. A statement piece, really. They took his crown, then his dignity, then his memory. But history inconveniently remembers everything, especially when another king soon met a blade in the dark. Henry VI. 5. Henry VI. Henry VI was not born for the throne. He was born into it, a baby king before he could even walk, inheriting a crown, a war, and a mental illness no one knew how to name. He was gentle, devout, and hopelessly unsuited to rule a country that wanted a warrior and got a monk in a robe. His reign was bookended by disaster. The 100 Years' War collapsed under his watch. France was lost. The Wars of the Roses tore England in half. His queen fought in his name while he drifted in and out of reality, reportedly going silent for months at a time, lost in a world only he could see. Kings were supposed to command armies. Henry stared at walls. He was captured, restored, captured again. A royal yo-yo, pulled by whichever house had the upper hand. By the time Edward IV reclaimed the throne in 1471, Henry was locked in the Tower of London. 1 month later, he was dead. The official word was melancholy. The unofficial truth was whispered. He'd been murdered, probably stabbed in prayer, in the very chapel where he once clung to God as his last shield. His blood stained the stones. His ghost, they say, never quite left. Neither did the next tragedy, one even younger, quieter, and missing for centuries, Edward V. 6. Edward V. Edward V. Never reigned, not really. He was crowned in theory but not in practice. A king without a throne, a boy with too many powerful uncles. At 12 years old, he entered the Tower of London expecting a coronation. He never came out. He and his younger brother Richard were the princes in the tower, names that still echo like an unfinished lullaby. After their father's death in 1483, young Edward was supposed to be guided by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. But guidance quickly turned into guardianship, and guardianship into permanent residence behind locked doors. The official story? He was being protected. The whispered one? He was being removed, sidelined, disappeared. The crown eventually passed to Richard, now Richard III, while the princes faded into myth. No trial, no grave, no explanation. Centuries later, bones were found beneath a staircase in the tower. 2 small skeletons, never officially identified. A state funeral was held, but no closure followed. Just more questions and the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. A prince who vanished is tragedy enough, but a pair of them? That's legend. And the second boy in that shadow deserves his own page, Prince Richard, Duke of York. 7. Prince Richard, Duke of York. Prince Richard, the younger of the 2 vanished brothers, was only about 10 years old when he was last seen alive. That's the sort of detail history tends to rush past. He wasn't just a prince, he was a child. Bright, reportedly clever, said to resemble his father, Edward IV. He was also the backup plan, because if anything happened to Edward V, little Richard would inherit the whole fractured kingdom. That's the trouble with being next in line during a power vacuum. People start asking what might happen if you were simply out of the picture. After their confinement in the Tower of London in 1483, both brothers disappeared. Richard's fate is tied to his brothers, but he often gets overshadowed by the crown Edward never wore. Yet it's Richard who haunts the mystery most. Smaller, younger, voiceless. The kind of absence that keeps historians up at night. Some say the boys were smothered. Others insist they were sent away in secret. Pretenders claiming to be Richard popped up years later, but none could prove it. All we know for certain is this: he went into the tower with his brother and never came out. A royal childhood reduced to a historical ellipsis. And the man who likely took the crown in their place? He met a fate far less mysterious and far more brutal: Richard III. 8. Richard III. For a man accused of killing children, Richard III sure ended up buried under a parking lot. It's the kind of historical punchline that writes itself. But the truth is messier and far more tragic. Richard III ruled for just over 2 years, but his reputation has stretched across centuries like a shadow too long to ignore. He came to the throne in 1483 under circumstances that were, to put it kindly, suspicious. His nephews vanished. His allies grew nervous. But Richard was no cartoon villain. He enacted legal reforms, curbed corruption, and even showed surprising loyalty to his supporters. Still, that didn't stop whispers about the tower, or silence them. In 1485, he rode out to Bosworth Field to face Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, in one of the last true battles of the Wars of the Roses. Richard fought viciously, reportedly leading a cavalry charge in a last-ditch effort to kill Henry himself. He failed. Struck down in the mud, abandoned by his allies, stripped and displayed like a trophy. His body was buried hastily in a friary. Centuries later, it turned up under a Leicester car park, spine curved from scoliosis, skull damaged from battle. Even in death, he was exposed. But if Richard was defined by ambition, the next royal's fate was shaped by betrayal. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Graphic, but suspicious. It was, in short, one of the most notorious royal assassinations in British history. No one was ever convicted. Mary's reputation never recovered, and Darnley, ambitious, arrogant, doomed, became a cautionary footnote in the war of crowns and hearts. But war isn't always about plots and poison. Sometimes it's just a cannon misfiring. Which brings us to James II of Scotland. 10. James II of Scotland. James II of Scotland lived fast and died unexpectedly. A bold and sometimes volatile monarch, he came to power as a child following his father's assassination and spent his formative years surrounded by regents, backstabbing nobles, and a kingdom that seemed to lurch from one vendetta to another. By the time he was old enough to rule in his own right, James had developed a reputation for decisive and occasionally impulsive actions. He was obsessed with modern warfare, particularly artillery. The cannon was the future, and James was determined to drag Scotland into that future by sheer force of gunpowder. In 1460, during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English-held strongholds in Scotland, James brought out his prized cannons, determined to showcase their power. And he did, just not in the way he intended. One of the cannons exploded during firing, killing the king almost instantly. The details were quickly swept up in patriotic myth-making, but the truth remained stark. James II died in battle not by sword or enemy hand, but by the very weapon he had pinned his military hopes upon. His death was sudden, undignified, and mechanical, not unlike modern warfare itself. And speaking of sudden deaths under mysterious conditions, the next royal took his final plunge not on a battlefield, but in the sky. Prince George, Duke of Kent. 11. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was never meant to be invisible. Glamorous, artistic, and deeply modern, he was one of those 20th century royals who seemed more suited for glossy magazines than dusty ledgers. The younger brother of Edward VIII and George VI, he carved out a different identity, one of parties, uniforms, and quietly controversial interests. But then came World War II, and George, like many royals, was called into service. In 1942, he boarded a military aircraft for what was supposed to be a routine flight over Scotland. It crashed into a hillside near Dunbeath, killing everyone on board but one. The crash report cited bad weather and navigation errors. The headlines called it a tragedy. But the silence afterward, that's where the mystery started. Rumors swirled. Conspiracy theories brewed. Some claimed he was on a secret mission. Others whispered about what, or who, was really on that flight. The official files stayed closed for decades, and the royal family characteristically said little. George was buried with honors, but questions lingered about the flight, the crash, and the man himself. His was a modern royal death, not dramatic, not theatrical, but quiet, bureaucratic, and permanently unclear. And for the next royal, unclear is an understatement. In fact, the only thing we know for certain is that King Edmund Ironside died, and very few agreed on how. 12. King Edmund Ironside. King Edmund Ironside had the kind of name that begs for a heroic saga, and he almost earned it. In 1016 he became king during one of England's most brutal periods, locked in a bitter struggle against the Danish invader Knut. Yes, that Knut. For a brief, flickering moment, Edmund seemed poised to turn the tide. He fought 5 major battles in a single year, earning his martial nickname and the fear of his enemies. But then, just as a treaty was negotiated to divide the kingdom, he died. Just like that. No final battle, no long reign, no glory. The official cause? Illness. The unofficial ones? Take your pick. Chroniclers couldn't agree if he died naturally, or if something more deliberate occurred behind the scenes. Some claimed he collapsed from exhaustion or internal wounds. Others suggested treachery, a betrayal at the moment of fragile peace. One version, particularly theatrical, was whispered centuries later and discarded just as quickly. Too elaborate, too scandalous, too suspiciously convenient. Whatever the truth, the timing was impeccable. Knut inherited the whole kingdom. Edmund's heirs were quietly exiled, and the man who could have saved Anglo-Saxon England vanished not in battle, but in a blur of doubt. But not all royal disappearances are political. Some are deeply personal, like the quiet tragedy of Prince John. 13. Prince John. Prince John was born in 1905 into a world that already seemed unsure what to do with him. The youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, he was royal by blood but distant by circumstance, kept mostly out of public view from an early age. At first, people said he was delicate. Later, it became clear he was living with epilepsy and what modern readers might recognize as autism. But at the time, medical understanding was thin and royal patience thinner. As his seizures worsened and his behavior became more difficult to manage, John was quietly relocated to a private estate called Wood Farm on the Sandringham grounds. There, he lived apart from his siblings, cared for by a small group of attendants and largely forgotten by the royal machine. Photographs of him vanish from the record. Mentions grow fewer. His world grew smaller. He died in 1919 at just 13 years old after a severe seizure. His parents did not attend the funeral. Queen Mary later wrote in her diary that it was a relief, a phrase that still reads like a wound. Officially, he became a symbol of compassion. Unofficially, he was a royal child hidden away because he did not fit the mold. And while John was quietly erased, the next royal knew the burden of surviving and living with grief for decades. Henry, Duke of Gloucester. 14. Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was a soldier, a dutiful brother, and perhaps the most overlooked royal of his generation. The third son of George V, he never made headlines, which, in royal circles, is either a blessing or a sentence. He served in World War II, took on ceremonial roles, and lived much of his life in the long shadow of other people's tragedies. The most defining of those was the sudden, unexplained death of his brother, Prince George, the Duke of Kent. Henry was never quite the same afterward. Those close to him described a man of loyalty and routine, but also of distance. A walking reminder of the branch of the royal family that carried the weight, but not the crown. In his later years, Henry's health began to decline. Strokes left him weakened and partially paralyzed. His public appearances dwindled, and he faded into a kind of noble isolation. He died in 1974, largely out of the public eye, in the same quiet way he had lived, present but peripheral. Henry's life was not marked by scandal or spectacle, but by the slow erosion of legacy. And if Henry faded gently, the next royal left with a scream the entire nation heard: Princess Charlotte of Wales. 15. Princess Charlotte of Wales. Princess Charlotte of Wales was supposed to be the future. Born in 1796, she was the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, and with her birth came the hope of a new era. A royal woman raised in an age of revolution, expected to bring stability to a crumbling dynasty. She was intelligent, opinionated, and fiercely loved by the public. When she married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, Britain exhaled. For once, things seemed to be going right. Then came childbirth. In November 1817, Charlotte went into labor. It lasted over 50 hours. No one intervened. Not quickly, not wisely. The baby, a son, was stillborn. Hours later, Charlotte herself died from complications. She was 21. The double loss, mother and child, shattered the nation. Shops closed. People wept in the streets. The entire country mourned as if a queen had died. And in a way, one had. Charlotte was not just a princess. She was the heir. Her death threw the monarchy into a succession crisis that would eventually lead to the reign of Queen Victoria, Charlotte's cousin. But that's history. At the time, all anyone could feel was the vacuum left by a bright young woman who never got to rule. And the next royal? He too was supposed to be king, until fate handed him a coffin instead. Prince Albert Victor. 16. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Prince Albert Victor was everything a royal should be, on paper. Handsome, tall, heir to the throne. But behind the portraits and the pomp, there was uncertainty. Known to his family as Eddie, he was the eldest son of the future Edward VII and second in line to the British throne. His education was patchy, his health reportedly fragile, and his personality, well, elusive. Some saw him as gentle and well-meaning. Others, less kindly, called him dull and unremarkable. The expectations piled high, and he never seemed to find his footing beneath them. In 1892, while the country was preparing for his grand future, Albert Victor died suddenly during an influenza pandemic at just 28 years old. The official cause was pneumonia. Some speculated that his immune system had always been too delicate. Others blamed the doctors. In any case, the royal family was stunned. Queen Victoria was devastated. His fiancée, Princess Mary of Teck, eventually married his younger brother, later George V, because the royal machine doesn't pause for grief. Albert Victor's death changed the course of British history. Had he lived, he would have been king instead of George V, grandfather to both Edward VIII and George VI. The crown's line turned on a fever, a funeral, and a future undone. And speaking of royal deaths, tangled with appetite and irony, meet Henry I, the king who ate himself to death. 17. Henry, a king. Henry I of England was a warrior, a reformer, and a man with a notoriously strong stomach. Until one day, it betrayed him. Born around 1068, Henry was the fourth son of William the Conqueror, and not the most likely candidate for the crown. But he outmaneuvered, outlasted, and occasionally outlived his brothers to take the throne in 1100. His reign brought order, legal structure, and the usual quota of medieval drama, wars, illegitimate children, he had dozens, and the tragic drowning of his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster. By the time he reached his 60s, a remarkable age for the era, Henry had settled into power. Then, while visiting Normandy in 1135, he sat down for a feast. The menu included his favorite delicacy, lampreys, eel-like fish, rich and oily, considered a royal treat. Despite being warned against overindulgence by his physicians, Henry reportedly ignored their advice. He fell ill shortly after the meal, suffering for days before finally dying. The cause? A surfeit of lampreys. It became the punchline of his legacy. A king who survived wars, rebellions, and family betrayals, but not dinner. His death left a power vacuum and plunged the realm into civil war. And yet, lampreys weren't the deadliest thing in the woods. That title may belong to the next king, William II, who never came back from the hunt. 18. William II. Rufus. William II, known as Rufus for his ruddy complexion, ruled England from 1087 to 1100. And if you believe the chroniclers, he did so with a temper, a glint in his eye, and not many friends. The second son of William the Conqueror, Rufus inherited the English crown while his older brother took Normandy. His reign was marked by quarrels with the church, occasional rebellions, and a general air of irreverence that didn't sit well with the moralizers of the age. He died as dramatically as he lived. In August 1100, Rufus went hunting in the New Forest. It was a king's pastime, 1 part leisure, 2 parts performance. That day, he was struck by an arrow. The story goes that one of his own men, Walter Tyrrell, loosed the fatal shot. Whether it was an accident, misfire, or something more deliberate, has never been settled. What we do know is that Rufus's body was left behind, reportedly abandoned by his hunting party. It was later recovered by peasants and carted back in a farmer's cart. No public mourning. No royal ceremony. His death was convenient for many, particularly his younger brother Henry, who claimed the crown the next morning. But the chaos didn't begin with Rufus. It began with the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold II, who saw death on the battlefield in a way few royals ever did. 19. King Harold II. King Harold II wasn't born to rule. He wrestled the crown into his hands. The last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, Harold Godwinson rose through nobility, ambition, and the political finesse of surviving Edward the Confessor's court. But when Edward died in January 1066, Harold seized the throne. What followed was less a reign and more a countdown. Within months, England was hit from two sides. The Norwegians invaded from the north, and the Normans from the south. Harold fought off the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge in a brutal clash that should have secured his crown, except William of Normandy arrived almost immediately afterward. At the Battle of Hastings, Harold led his exhausted army against William's fresh forces. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and long. By the end of the day, Harold was dead. The Bayeux tapestry famously depicts him being struck in the eye by an arrow, a clean image for a messy truth. His body was so badly mangled that his mistress was reportedly the only one who could identify it by marks only she would know. His death marked more than the end of a king. It was the end of Anglo-Saxon England. The Normans moved in. The culture changed. The language bent. Harold became a relic of a lost world. And before that world disappeared entirely, one final boy king met his end in shadow. Edward the Martyr. 20. Edward the Martyr. Edward the Martyr was barely 15 when he became king, and not much older when he was murdered. Born around 962, Edward inherited the crown in the wake of his father Edgar's death. His reign was short, chaotic, and entirely defined by the adults around him. His stepmother, Elfthraith, favored her own son, Ethelred, for the throne. Nobles split loyalties. The church tried to hold things together. Edward had the title, but not the control. In 978, while visiting Elfthraith at Corfe Castle, Edward was reportedly greeted warmly, and then killed. Stabbed by one of her attendants, his body was hidden without ceremony. It was not a glorious death. It was not even a recorded one, really. Chroniclers pieced it together after the fact. Whether Elfthraith ordered it or simply looked the other way, the result was the same. Edward was gone, and her son Ethelred was king. The outrage was swift. The young king was buried in haste, then reburied with honor once the political winds shifted. He was declared a martyr by the church, a saint by the faithful, and a symbol of innocence betrayed. His death lingered not because of who he was, but because of what it said about power. How fragile, how cold, how quick. And with Edward the Martyr, the list ends. But the royal tragedies do not. They never really end. They simply change names, costumes, and timelines.